So we're back on the air with an Arab and a Jew. I'm Rebecca, and this is Lee. And we're going to be talking this time about whether the settlements in the West Bank by Israel are an obstacle to peace. This is a hotly contested topic, and we're going to see today if between the two of us, this is hotly contested. So Lee, do you think that the settlements in the West Bank are an obstacle to peace?
Well, look, I don't even know if it's hotly contested. The last time we tried to do a debate on Coro, the results were almost even all the way through the month. This topic almost immediately launched into a huge gap between those in favour and those against. So it seems a lot more people believe settlements are an obstacle to peace in the West Bank than don't. And that's people on both sides of the debate.
Well, Cora is also a biased sample of people. I think that in terms of what you would get from what people say on Quora, you're not going to get a representative sample of the population. Another question is, which population? Which population do you consider to be the relevant population? This is English language Quora, and most of these people, all of these people, are going to be fluent in English. And a lot of them living outside the country in the Anglophone world. So this is a sampling that is probably more liberal Zionist than Israelis as a whole. Whereas...
So if you were, okay, so as a topic, if you were looking to post the question to just Israelis, I think, and this is intuitive, I don't know this for sure, but I think you would get a 50-50 mix. Pick another topic, like last month's topic was I didn't understand that. US states legislating against BDS or acting in contravention of the US Constitution. And there was a lot more polar than this. So it was 50-50 all the way through the month and just came in favour towards the end of the month with maybe 2 or 3 additional Palestinians weighing in. This one has been wildly in favour of they are an obstacle to peace. So I think if you, and again, intuitive, I've got no evidence of this, but I think if you were just sampling Israelis, this might be a 50-50 question. If you're sampling the rest of the world, it's going to shift predominantly in favour of, yes, they are an obstacle to peace.
Well, also, Israelis are really the ones who are actually directly benefiting from the settlements. The rest of the world is not living in the West Bank.
Yes.
And so it's easier for people outside of the country to say, this is an obstacle to peace. The other thing too is, how are we defining peace? How are we defining what's an obstacle? The truth is, peace takes 2 groups to agree, at least this kind of peace. And so Israel and Palestine had been going along the lines for a very long time that peace looked like a 2-state solution. Now, there are other arrangements for peace, but if there is going to be another such arrangement, this needs to be communicated. The settlements certainly look like an obstacle to peace if the framing is that peace is the 2-state solution, which is what the whole diplomatic discussion had been about for a very long time. So I would say, yes, the settlements are an obstacle to peace myself, because you need to look like you are on board and are an honest broker. By this point, if Israel and Palestine were going to be broken into two states along the lines that have been discussed. A very large number of people, maybe not a very large number of people, but definitely many thousands of people would need to be moved. If they're not moved, then the alternative is land swaps. Land swaps are something else that the countries could discuss between them. However, the more items there are to discuss, the harder it gets.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. You're adding a level of complexity to an already complex issue. And if you take the view that, say, Oslo was the last formal attempt at a peace agreement, and then even the Omar and Abbas talks were the last attempt at genuine peace deal. They both centered around a two-state solution, and both of those were impacted dramatically by the settlements. There is an argument from a lot of pro-Israeli supporters that the conflict was there before the settlement started. I don't think settlements are the only issue, but as I said, I think they add a level of complexity that doesn't need to be there. They also indicate a level of hubris from the Israeli side, because the international community has said that the settlements are illegal. Israel said, no, they're not. But that's like the thief in the court saying, no, I didn't steal anything. So it's not unexpected that you would expect Israel to say, no, they're not. The other is that Israel has never said that the West Bank is part of Israel. It's even admitted that it's disputed territories, yet even though it's disputed territories, it's still annexing and building settlements and transferring populations into there.
Well, the other thing too about the settlements in their defense, first of all, Israel is a country that has been attacked a large number of times. And if it's attacked in the middle, it's kind of narrow if you're only going by Israel's 67 borders. So people have discussed the area of the West Bank as supplying a needed buffer zone from external attacks, which is a real threat. And we're talking about people's lives at stake here that could be genocided. And so that's one factor in defense of the settlements. A second factor is, although it hasn't actually worked, it could be seen as putting time pressure on the Palestinians to agree. Now, it ended up doing the opposite, but was that known when this process was earlier on?
Okay. Let me address the first point first, the defense buffer. I think that that was all taken into consideration in the Oslo Accords, in that a military presence was allowed in the Golan and on the border of Jordan. So that the whole West Bank doesn't need to be a buffer, because Israel is still going to have military control of the West Bank, even in a two-state settlement. So it's a demilitarized state for the Palestinians, and the security aspects are under Israelis' control. So I don't think that's a solid argument. That, like, for having a defense buffer, settlements is not the only answer, and it's certainly not the most congenial answer. The other point that you made, what was the second point that you made.
The second point was that the settlement expansion could be seen as putting time pressure on the Palestinians, especially when the process was in process.
Okay, so if you have, let's say Likud has got 2 decades of governing. Sharon didn't want to continue with Oslo, and certainly Netanyahu, who accounts for the majority of that 2 decades, didn't want to continue with Oslo, and both increased settlement activity during their presidency. So to suggest that it was putting pressure on the Palestinians to come up with a peace deal, even if they had, the 2 prime ministers of the last 2 decades were not interested in listening.
Well, first of all, with the settlements and the security issue. So a treaty, even when it's made, it can be broken. Trump, for example, pulled the US out of the climate agreements that it had signed, and he canceled the Iran deal. These are serious breaches of international agreements. Now, if international agreements are made, they need to be enforced, and there needs to be a penalty for breaking them. And it shouldn't be just at the whims of whichever leadership is in power at any particular moment. So if Israel and Palestine make a deal where the West Bank is even one where the West Bank is a demilitarized zone, that's only one formulation of what could happen at the end of this process, but by no means the only formulation. There are formulations where Palestine would be fully independent. But if Israel and Palestine make any kind of deal, and Palestine could break it, Israel could break it too, but let's say that this is Palestine who breaks it. And then we have Israel narrow. If Palestine militarizes against a demilitarization agreement, gets support from some other country, then we're dealing with an Israel that's narrow.
Yeah, although I could see that would have been an issue in 1948, probably even an issue in 1967, maybe even an issue in 1970s. I don't think that there is provocation or benefit for that to be a problem now. I think the political environment globally has changed, and certainly in the region it's changed. You now have the Abraham Accords, you've got a peace deal with Egypt and Jordan that's held up for God knows how long. You've got the KSAs getting closer and closer to Israel in terms of buddying and mutual trade. And you've got the US standing in the way, saying that almost like the principal of a school saying, getting in between 2 groups of kids that are fighting. So I don't see, and certainly if it works and it's a benefit to the Palestinians and the Israelis, nobody wants to fix what's not broken.
Well, I don't see in the current political climate at the moment any of the treaties Israel has being broken. However, this does not necessarily mean that these treaties won't be broken. What holds up at the moment is not something that is guaranteed to hold up in the future. And the treaty is not just for one political climate, it's for many political climates. This agreement is supposed to...
I hear that, but the same argument could be mounted for putting settlements into Egypt or putting settlements into Jordan, or trying to regain the Negev or the Sunni desert. These agreements are in place. Somebody can step in and break them Egypt could get another, Sisi could have potentially have said, no, we don't like what Israel's doing to the Palestinians and break the peace treaty that existed. The prince who became the king of Jordan could have said the same thing. You don't know what individuals are going to do, yet all you could do is rely on the peace to hold when you've got that much people that you're talking about, when you've got 5 million Palestinians. If it was just 200,000 or 300,000, that would be okay. But you're talking about a state for 5 million people. That's a nation. And to say that we don't trust that sometime in the future you're going to elect somebody that's going to secure that peace deal for us is pretty disingenuous. You can't do global political agreements on that basis.
On the other hand, is it a good idea for countries to be making a deal with the U.S.? It might not be a good idea for another country to be making a deal with the U.S., given the U.S.'s long record of breaking treaties since the ones that were made in the 19th century with Native Americans that they just walked all over, all the way up to Trump's pulling out of his agreements and Biden's dropping of Afghanistan, leaving his allies in the lurch. So,
look, one of the reasons that democracies work is because there's checks and balances in place. So if a politician does something wrong, there are checks and balances that'll pick it up. If a policeman does something wrong, there are checks and balances that'll pick it up. They don't always work, and they're not always highly effective. But at least you can hope that justice is going to be served. On a global scale, we've got the UN. And if you're a small tin pot nation that has got no muscle, then the UN is great. It can prosecute Tony 2000. What was his name? It can send troops into East Timor to liberate it. It can stop the Bosnians and the Croatians from killing each other. But when it comes to trying to sanction a China or a US or a Russia, even their allies like Israel, it's got no teeth. So it can pass resolutions, but it can't action those resolutions.
Well, this is the thing. If you're in power, then you write the rules. So the fact remains that for the foreseeable future, neither Israel nor Palestine are in power. So in both of their cases, it depends on who their allies are.
And you don't think Israel's in power?
What?
You don't think Israel is in power? I think Palestinians have got no power.
Well,
I think Israel's got an immense amount of power, political push, muscle, military power, economic power, like, you name it. It's Israel is it towers all over the Palestinians.
Israel has more power than the Palestinians, but neither of them are world powers. Israel is still a regional country. At most, it's a regional power, and it's very much beholden to the superpowers. It's not so closely beholden to the US, but it could switch its allies at some point. But if everyone turns against it, that's an issue.
Agree, although the US is not likely to turn. Look, it's got some pretty good mechanisms in place. I think AIPAC is a huge detriment to peace because of its political lobby. Nothing Israel can do will incur the ire of the US because of AIPAC. Unless it's, obviously something genocidal or, but that doesn't mean that it's the international. I mean, it's obvious the amount of resolutions Israel's constantly talking about. We're being picked on far more than any other nation, but that's because nothing gets done. A resolution gets issued, it's not resolved. There's nobody prepared to take a stance against Israel, and therefore it's raised again, and again and again, and then Israel starts to feel like it's being singled out. It's only a handful of issues that it's being singled out on, which is the settlements in the West Bank, the occupation, the wall, and Gaza's blockade. They're the only issues that keep getting raised.
Well, the truth is, and this is also another reason that the settlements are an obstacle to peace, the majority of the world has come on board, recognizes both Israel and Palestine, and recognizes Israel fundamentally at its 1967 borders and Palestine fundamentally as the West Bank plus Gaza. Now, there are countries that don't recognize Israel or they don't recognize Palestine, but this is the majority view worldwide.
Yes.
And so,
although Israel doesn't recognize Palestine.
But Palestine recognizes Israel, which is also very interesting. But recognition there, it's also, there's a lot more going on. They're still talking to each other and negotiating, even without the formal diplomatic relations.
Yeah, and they're doing it in the background, but every time they come, so here's my view on following the conflict throughout my life. Every time they come close to a resolution, Israel backs out, and then the stakes get higher. They want more and want to give the Palestinians less. So we go right back to 1948, and it was basically 50-50. Then the war broke out. Palestinians said no, and understandably, I think given the economic and the political environment at the time, it's understandable any nation would have said no. In hindsight, it was a bad move, but hindsight's a great thing. So they get 50-50, then Israel says, no, we want a little bit more. Then 67 war erupts. Israel takes the West Bank and Gaza and says, oh, look, we don't really want to give them back. Then the Oslo Agreement kicks in, and suddenly the West Bank's got smaller, and they're talking about annexing even more. So I think every time the Palestinians come close to agreeing, Israel backs away and says, no, we'll wait. And it's been to the advantage of Israel. So they've managed to increase the settler population from 30,000 30 years ago to close to 600,000, 700,000, some people say, today.
Well, they've both backed down throughout the course of this arrangement. What I've seen is that it goes in cycles, the arrangement. Israel is the one who tends to initiate these agreements, who tends to propose these agreements. And in terms of how generous they are, it sort of goes in cycles. There was Rabin, Barak, and then Netanyahu, Sharon, and then there was Omer. And Omer came back to being more generous, followed by Netanyahu, who obviously wasn't going to get it through. And now the pendulum might be swinging back again towards a government that, it's hard for me to believe that they would be less inclined than Netanyahu. And there are kind of two shots. One is Bennett. I don't think Bennett is going to get this through because his constituency has been including some very pro-settlement people. And also, he's still tying together the new government. He has a lot to juggle with all the different movable pieces with his government, but he's still trying to improve things for Palestinians within the framework of the occupation. Now, Lapid might have a better chance of getting this through. First of all, the government, if Lapid comes to power, this government would be more established. And he also has a constituency that is more friendly to this kind of solution historically. Other people think Lapid may be making other types of changes, but we'll have to see. But I do get the impression that this solution might be now or never with the Lapid government.
Look, I'm not as optimistic as you. I certainly don't think Bennett's going to do it. If you listen to some of the interviews the public interviews that he's had, his speech at the UN, where he claimed that the Torah was the title deed for the Jews to Israel, and he repeated that with an interview with on Al Jazeera head to head. And he's said that there is not going to be a two-state solution, and he said there's not going to be a one-state solution. And then he smiled and said, so we need to figure out how we're going to live together. So I don't see him as being instrumental in a peace deal. I don't know who else is in there that advocates for peace. I mean, but then again, Olmert wasn't loudly advocating for a two-state solution, but that's what he worked towards when he came into power. So you don't know. Things could pop up and surprise you, but given what I've heard to date, I don't see that there is a potential for a two-state, which is sad, because what Israel is doing, it's either going to be forced by the international community eventually to form a one-state solution, or it's going to be a pariah state. And I think that's Netanyahu's work. He's built the settlements in such a way as to make a two-state solution almost impossible. Most commentators say that it's not, it's off the table now, which leaves only a one-state solution as a peaceful solution.
Well, one of my concerns is that, is that the governments of Israel are so concerned with their immediate constituencies that they're not really thinking that long term. So I think there is a chance under Lapid. I agree with you that it's not probable, but I think that of the three regimes, Lapid, Bennett, and Netanyahu, the chance is highest under Lapid. Probably the way to think about the solution is, what do we think the probability is of this happening in a particular cycle? So with Lapid, I'd call it maybe 10 or 15% that he'd actually make the push to get it through. So maybe we could have closing statements at this point.
All right. I just want to ask, do you think that the settlements were, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Closing statements. Let me just go to the closing statement. If I think of it in between, I'll let you know. What concerns me is, well, it doesn't concern me, but it should certainly concern a lot of Israelis. If there is a peace achieved 50 years from now, what is this generation going to look like to them?
I would say it probably depends what kind of peace it is. So if there is a peaceful one-state equal solution 50 years from now that stays this way, this generation might look paranoid. If there is a peace full two-state solution, 50 years from now, that looks like it's going to stay, this generation might look divided, might look like there were people on the right side of history, there were people on the wrong side of history. Most generations, looking at it through future eyes, have people who were on the right side and people who are on the wrong side, and we don't know which is which. Now, if there's crazy fighting 50 years from now, then that would vindicate elements of the right who would say you shouldn't have let up the pressure on your enemy. Now, let's hope that this is not going to be the case, and this is something else that we can set the groundwork for.
One other question I just want to ask, what do you think the right's end goal is in Israel?
I don't think the right is exactly a monolith. There are different sectors of the right that have different end goals. So some of them, their end goal is to settle the biblical land. That's part of the religious right. Another part of the right's end goal would be to...
So if they do that, let me take you back a step. If they do that, what would happen to the Palestinians and what would happen to Gaza and the West Bank?
So Gaza might get its independence eventually as part of their end goal. And the Palestinians, the West Bank, what they would do with them, it really varies. Some of them would give them full citizenship. They get equality. It would be one state of Israel plus the West Bank with equal rights. Some of them would not give them equal rights. They might keep up the status quo with them. Some of them are happy with the status quo. And there are other sectors of the right that don't want the entire territory exactly, but basically would want a secure state. The current status quo is actually a lot of sectors of Israelis' end goal. Israel is a state that Israelis can travel around the country and they only occasionally have to worry about bombs and rockets flying in. They're not under immediate attack by any of their neighbors. They can wake up in the morning and say that tomorrow there won't be an attack from our neighbors. And their relations are only improving with many of the other countries in the region. So that, plus they have this booming technology economy that they've really built up to being a world-class economy. So this is the end goal of a lot of sectors of Israeli society in many respects. And this may be one reason that there is so much resistance to change.
Okay. If you were to say the mainstream right, so the majority, if they decided on the status quo, you think that that they would be okay continuing the occupation for another 100 years, or?
I think they would prefer not to, but
so if they don't, and then again, we're only talking about the right. If they prefer not to, what's the other option?
The other option would be some form of a two-state solution. Not one necessarily that would be supported by the international community, but two-state has definitely become mainstream in Israeli politics.
So do you think there's anyone on the right saying the growth and location of these settlements is making two states impossible?
I think that a lot of the right is kind of reluctant to tread on the toes of what looks like it's shaping up to be a growing Israeli demographic. Now, there's not everybody who's a settler is ideologically committed to the settlement project. Some of them are people who just moved there because it's less expensive, and they're living in what are basically suburbs.
Yeah.
And technically over the Green Line, but these are basically suburbs. That's what a lot of settlers are in. And, but even so, this could have been how they got their home. Now, if you got your home.
And look, I don't think there's anybody, I don't think any of us, if we were Jewish and Israeli and could save $100,000 on a house that's brand new in a suburb that's security is guaranteed by the government, we would give it up. You'd say, well, look, it's here. I don't necessarily agree with the strategy or the policy, but it's here, and I'd be stupid not to take advantage of it.
Yes. And these are also the people who they're less incentivized to stop the more outlying settlements. The more outlying settlements and the unofficial settlements, unauthorized settlements, these are not really at odds at this point with their ability to get their home. Now, if they were at odds with their ability to get their home, if they were basically, you give us a bad name, then the tune might change of the people who are in the nearer settlements. But there's not that kind of pressure.
Yeah, no, there isn't. And I think, look, to get that sort of pressure, it needs to come from the international community. And I don't see that happening. BDS is probably the only pressure group at the moment. Even the UN, it was just fortunate that in 2016, Obama happened to be on his way out and could afford to abstain from Resolution 2234, I think it was. Any other point in history, if that resolution was on the table, if it was at the start of Obama's term in office, then it wouldn't have gotten through. He would have vetoed it. If it was any other president, it would have been vetoed. So I don't see the UN taking a role in trying to necessarily get Israel into, pull Israel into line and stop the settlements. But I can see the international community, citizens of Western countries, Western superpowers, democracies, becoming more aware of what's going on and then taking a stand. And I think that's happening more and more. And certainly the internet has changed the dynamics to a large extent. But look, I don't know. You tell me, do you agree that they are an obstacle to peace?
Well, I've basically said I do think that the settlements, especially with the way the peace process has gone on its trajectory, the settlements are an obstacle to peace. At the minimum, they create more moving parts.
Yeah.
And they are, and as you have said, they are not the only obstacle to peace, but they are a significant one.
Yes, they add another level of complexity that doesn't need to be there.
Yes, and especially if you want to have a positive, clean dynamic, you don't add more moving pieces if you can help.
Yes.
And so,
and look, the charge of an apartheid state, if this settlement, the settlement projects continues for another decade, then more and more the charge of being an apartheid state looks more and more valid.
Well, and the pitch is going to be higher and higher and higher. And even Meretz was starting to go there. Meretz basically threatened that they would start to call Israel an apartheid state if it did the annexation. It didn't end up doing the annexation, but this was what Nitzan Horowitz of Meretz said. Now, if Meretz is going there, this has gone pretty mainstream in the international community. Meretz might be a small and fringe party in Israel, but its type of views are a lot more common in a place like the US or Europe. And so...
Yeah. And look, the fact that the Jewish party has taken that stance is a plus. Because I don't know that, I don't know necessarily that any party has really thought that. I can see so many people in Israel were disillusioned with the Oslo when it first was signed, when which is sad, because that meant that it was going to be undermined almost the day it was signed.
Well, these accords, they were going through with significant subsectors of both publics being strongly, strongly against them. Now, the hope was that the people for them would form a plurality, even if not a majority, and push them through. But this did not materialize. So unfortunately, I do believe that things in many key ways continue to be on the wrong track.
Look, one of the things that's interesting, I was listening to a podcast recently, and the speaker was in Gaza when the Oslo Accords were signed, and she said that they were showing the iconic video of Yasser Arafat and was it wasn't Rabin? It was who was the shaking hands on the steps of the White House lawn. She said she was in Gaza when that was being aired, and the sense of adulation and the cheers that rose up was incredible. It was almost like you're experiencing New Year's Eve. She said the people were screaming in the streets. Laser lights of doves were being shone onto buildings, and the atmosphere was just joyous. That there was suddenly hope for peace, which is interesting, because I think it was maybe not representative of what was going on in the West Bank, and certainly not representative of what was going on in Israel. So, yeah, you're not going to get everybody on board, but certainly you've got to. The trouble is, the extremists on both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, can cause far more damage, even as a minority group, to any peace process than what the majority can, who support a peace process.
And this is why the center needs to be a strong and loud and proud voice to try to hold the fort. And so I'm going to end with that. Thank you for tuning in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in, and have a great day.
Thanks.